And Paula, you're on.
So I want to say welcome everyone this evening, and thank you for all our partners that have joined in. Really excited to have our speaker this evening. We've all can share a love of nature and have a lot of first experiences, and are I'm sure dedicated to children and their similar, hopefully, experiences as well in nature, and how it guides and helps in their development is crucial for their development. Marianne was instrumental. She's our person who was able to secure our speaker today. So I'm going to let her do the introduction, and then I'm just going to go and mute myself. So thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Okay. Well, of course, Richard Louv is an internationally acclaimed author. He's published in 24 countries. And probably best known for the phenomenal book Last Child in the Woods, which I read, and it changed my life, and it changed my children's life, although they fought me tooth and nail on it, Richard. But anyway, it's one of those seminal works that just changes everything for people who are involved with raising children. The title runs Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. And it is an excellent, excellent read. If you haven't read it, you must. And of course, this seminal work was his seventh book, so he is a prodigious writer. His current work is Our Wild Calling, which is also an excellent, excellent read. I highly recommend it. But in Last Child, he alerted us all to how kids were getting further and further from nature and how it leads to all kinds of serious health problems. He's also author of The Nature Principle, Vitamin N for Nature. And his efforts really started the Children and Nature Network, which has impacted most all of school curriculum throughout this country and throughout the world. He's been on TV, radio, NPR Fresh Air, that's my indicator of excellence right there, with Terry Gross. And he's presented at countless, international conferences, pediatrics conferences, won numerous honors and medals. And of course, for our crowd, the one that's really important to know about is he's gotten the National Audubon Medal, which people, the previous winners were people like Rachel Carson. I call Richard Louv kind of the Rachel Carson of our time. And we are just thrilled to death to have you speaking to us, Richard, and we can't wait to hear what you have to say. Thank you for coming and being our guest today.
Thank you. The Audubon Medal, by the way, not only really helped Last Child in the Woods find its audience, but my subsequent books as well. But it really helped stimulate the movement that grew out of Last Child and the work of a lot of other people, tens of thousands of volunteers. I'm not sure that it would have grown as fast as it did without the Audubon.
Whenever you're ready.
So I'm deeply appreciative of that. Let me talk for a couple of minutes about the pandemic, which is kind of on our minds right now, although I'm sure some of you would rather not hear that word right now. A strange thing has happened. We used to have to struggle to convince people that nature connection was fundamental to human health. During the pandemic, people have discovered, for a lot of reasons, that the birds right outside their window have something to do with their mental health, certainly. And the open space, the nature, even if it's in their backyard, if they're lucky enough to have one, or the raptor, for instance, on the ledge across an urban avenue that people can watch from their windows. All of those things have something to do with our survival, not only now, but as a species. And right now in the pandemic, we're realizing how inequitable the distribution of nature is. It's one of the things that urban folks, urban planners, mayors, architects are beginning to recognize, is that we absolutely need these parks. We need open space. We need nature around us, particularly during a time like this when we're trying to social distance and all of that. Our schools need nature around them. One of the good things that's happened in the last few years is the growth of the green schoolyard movement. Increasingly, schools, not enough of them, but increasingly schools are creating natural places outside the school or around the school. Sometimes they have gardens to grow things to eat. Sometimes they are native species. But these places that are in urban areas in particular, these natural places have a peculiar effect on people. Natural play spaces, for instance, just as an example, a place that kids can go out and see birds and escape the classroom for a little while. We know that kids learn much better in natural surroundings, most kids, not all kids. There's something about the stimulation of the senses that a natural environment does. But it has other effects too. On natural play spaces, for example, kids play differently. If you, studies have compared how kids play on a natural play space that has vegetation, that has something other than concrete and asphalt. They've compared those kids playing on those types of play spaces with kids playing on asphalt or concrete, typical playgrounds. The kids playing in the natural play spaces are far more likely to invent their own games. That's extremely important. It's an indicator of the development of executive function, which is the ability to be your own boss, the ability to have your own ideas, the ability to be creative, maybe someday to be an entrepreneur. The other things that they've noticed in these studies is that kids who play in natural play spaces compared to the typical playground are far more likely to invite other kids who don't look like them or are not the same gender, are not the same race, to play with them. There have been studies recently that have shown, and certainly birders understand this, that connecting with nature experiences are far more social than we have given them credit to be in past years. This has something to do not only with the glue that holds us together with the world, with the rest of life on this earth, but with each other. Violence tends to be muted in neighborhoods with more green. Health is better. Recent studies have shown that neighborhoods that have more green in them, that are more natural space, low birth rate, the birth weight is healthier, is not as low. In neighborhoods without nature, the birth weight of babies that are born in that neighborhood tend to be lower. And the less green you have, the lower the birth weight. That is a fundamental indicator of early mortality, of all kinds of developmental problems. So this is not a nice to have. This is not just a question of whether we appreciate nature or not. This is literally a life and death issue, particularly for the kids and the adults who live in neighborhoods that don't have any nature. Now, all neighborhoods have nature. One of the great things about birds is they're pretty much in every neighborhood. But this is one of the effects that the pandemic is having. When people think about public health now, they're thinking a lot more about the design of cities and whether there are natural places in neighborhoods. because it's not only healing, it protects us from much that we're experiencing in the pandemic. The other thing is we're realizing that natural schoolyards have some value. You know, in 1915, during the great tuberculosis pandemic or epidemic in the United States, they understood this. There were outdoor classrooms on the tops of buildings in New York City. They moved the kids outside for social distancing. They did this all over the country. Somehow we forgot that. Somehow that's, you know, too much in the past for us. And yet we know that not only are natural play spaces better for learning for many kids, better for social connections for many kids, but they're also better for health. They're much better during times of contagious diseases. There hasn't been very much movement in that direction during this pandemic. My brother is a high school student, high school teacher in Eureka, California, up on the northern coast. He was told in August that he had to go back to school and teach his students after having done it through Zoom for a while. He walked into the school and the desks were 3 feet apart. There was no talk of having outdoor classrooms for social distancing. There was no talk of the circulation of air in that building. They did ask the teachers to wear masks, and that's good. But we totally missed in most schools the possibility that we could hold class differently, just as they did in 1915, and have a lot less contagion. Now, young kids don't seem to pass the virus, don't catch COVID as much as older people do. But that doesn't mean they can't be contagious. They can pass the virus to other people, even though they're asymptomatic. Not only that, my brother is a high school teacher. By the time you're 18, you're getting up there. And that's a vulnerable time. My brother texted me last night and said, this is the second time he's been quarantined. There's more kids in his class now that have tested positive. You know, schools had no plan. I looked at the school, at the California state regulations at that time, or recommendations for schools regarding COVID. And they didn't really have a plan. We didn't have a national plan. We still don't have one. Nature can be a way to deal with the problems that come with nature. And we should be far more sophisticated about that than we are. But this is getting more attention now. One of the things that we have experienced too is a sense of isolation, of loneliness. One of the themes in the most recent book, Our Wild Calling, which I'm shamelessly promoting over my shoulder there. It's now out in paperback. But one of the themes of it is human loneliness. For decades now, several decades, medical community has been talking about and very concerned about what some medical folks call an epidemic of human loneliness, of isolation. And they have determined that human isolation is almost equal to both obesity and smoking in terms of an indicator of early mortality. The same diseases, many of them that are associated with obesity and smoking, are also associated with human loneliness. And they've been marking this. There's a recent study that looked generationally at who's lonely in America. And what they found, they looked at the greatest generation, baby boomers, X, Y, Z, all the rest of them. And what they found was that the younger people are in America, the lonelier they are. Now that's a stunning finding. You know, the cliche is that the older you get, the lonelier you get, right? All the songs, Simon and Garfunkel, old people sitting on the bench, all that stuff. It's now that has reversed. The younger you are, the lonelier you are generationally. What does it say about a society in which that is apparently true? Now, this epidemic or pandemic has been blamed. And by the way, it's obviously been aggravated by COVID because now people are really isolated. My wife and I haven't hugged our sons in almost a year. So people are really feeling this now. It's making us, again, pay more attention to an issue we weren't paying very much attention to. People have come up with a lot of folks and reasons to blame for this epidemic of human loneliness. You know, bad urban design. People are told to take walks. Walk where? In San Diego, you won't get very, very far before you run into a freeway overpass. Our fear of strangers is one of the big ones, stranger danger. Even though the murder rate has gone up recently, for decades it was going down. And during that same period, fear of strangers was skyrocketing. That's one of the main reasons kids have been kept indoors under essentially protective house arrest, disconnected from nature. And there are other reasons for this. And it turns out that many of the same reasons that children right now are far more disconnected from nature than their parents and their grandparents and the great-grandparents were. Many of the same reasons for that phenomenon also are the reasons for human loneliness, the epidemic of that. So this gets blamed on a lot of things. We can't blame everything on Mark Zuckerberg, though, on Facebook and anti-social media. In Our Wild Calling, I hypothesize that this rise in human loneliness, which is worldwide, is rooted in an even deeper loneliness, which is species loneliness. As a species, we are desperate to not feel alone in the world. Why else would we look for Bigfoot? I've spent time with Bigfoot hunters, and they're great folks, and I really had a good time with them. Why are they out there? And I asked that when I talked to the Bigfoot hunters, and they told me great stories about. But basically, even though some want to kill Bigfoot, a lot of them don't. One of the Bigfoot hunters, I asked a young guy, "Why are you doing this? What are you going to do if you find Bigfoot and walk across a meadow in the woods? What are you going to do?" And I said, "Are you going to shoot Bigfoot?" And he said, "No." "Well, are you going to take a picture?" "No." "So what are you going to do? Are you going to tell people?" He said, "I don't know. I haven't thought that through. I don't think so. People wouldn't believe me. They'd think I was crazy." "So why are you doing it?" I asked him. He just wants to connect. He just wants to see Bigfoot. I hypothesized a long time ago in a magazine article that the Bigfoot phenomenon is in fact species loneliness. Now, Bigfoot may exist, but this deep, deep loneliness of our species, this has religious implications, obviously. We need to not feel alone. But the irony is that we're not alone. You know this, as many of you are birders. We're not alone. We're surrounded by a great conversation. We're surrounded by animals who are talking to each other, within their own species, and across species, and to us. More than we know. The recent science in the last few years of animal communication has been stunning in what it has found. The specialness of humans is fast fading. Tool use, all this. Now language, not the kind of language we use. but in the book, I call it the oldest language. There are people studying this, ecopsychologists and others, and they're studying it in birds as well. That this oldest language has been here since before we were here. And there are common behaviors, there are common movements, common sounds that transcend species. When we listen to that conversation, when we're sensing that conversation, we feel less alone. I'll tell you a few stories through in the remaining moments. These are stories that were told to me about people's encounters with wild animals. Some of them were birds. Many of them were not, as well as relationships with their pets and the peculiar nature, the mystery of that connection. There's a guy at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla. He's an oceanographer. His name is Paul Dayton. He's one of the most famous oceanographers among oceanographers, highly respected. I think he's around 80 now. He is a hardcore scientist. He told me a story about when he was a student at the University of Washington. He was on the bottom of the ocean collecting samples. He was also collecting lunch because he was a starving student. And he's facing the bottom of the ocean and he's collecting these starfish samples, and he feels something come above him, something big, and it stops. That's usually not a good sign. And he looked up with one eye and he saw a big tentacle coming down. He looked up over here and saw another big tentacle coming down. And then he looked up, and at the risk of anthropomorphizing it, he said that this was one of the giant Pacific octopuses, 12-foot wingspan. And he said, it looked down at me and decided I was a clam, and it came down and got me. And it did. It wrapped him up in its arms, this huge octopus. He said, people think those arms are soft. They're anything but, you can't budge them. And these arms are peculiar because each of these tentacles is essentially has something like its own brain, independent brain, each of these arms. The skin of an octopus has filled with photons, the cells that help us see. Now, this octopus was not necessarily seeing Paul with its arms, but as Paul says, it was certainly getting to know him better. Around this time, Paul realized he was almost out of oxygen in his tank. And he kind of gave up. He did what prey often do in the mouth of predators, the gazelle in the mouth of the lion. He relaxed instinctively. And then something strange happened. The octopus relaxed just a little bit. And Paul, with his last strength, kicked off the bottom, and they went up and up and up in the column of water together. The octopus still wrapped around him. Paul could feel the octopus moving around his body. He could feel the razor sharp beak of the octopus moving around his neck until he was looking into the eye of the octopus. And when they made eye contact, again, something happened. Paul laughs when he says this, but he's serious. He's a little embarrassed about this. He says, I think we made our non-aggression pact. And the octopus let go and moved back slightly, a little bit away from him. And right then, Paul hit the surface of the water. And he rips off his mask. He's gasping for air. He looks down through the surface of the water, and he sees that the octopus is still there. And they're still making eye contact. And then the next thing that happens is the best part of the story, I think. What does Paul do next? He puts the mask back on, and as the octopus is disappearing down into the darkness, Paul dives and chases the octopus back down. And he told me this detail, which is not in the story in the book. He told me this later, and I wish I'd He told me that when he was telling me this story. As they went down, they spiraled each other. And he ran out of air again and he raced up to the top. And I said, why in the world would you do that? That's crazy, Paul. And he didn't know. He said, again, he's a hardcore scientist, but he used the word spiritual. Something happened. He can't explain. In him, between him and the octopus, somewhere something happened. And it changed him. It helped shape his career for the rest of his life. What he does know, he doesn't know if it was actually spiritual. He has that feeling. But what he does know is that he did not want those moments to end. And that's why he chased the octopus down into the dark. The second story. This is about a pet, a dog, and it's shorter. A mother in Toronto told me how they had a big dog named Jack. And she walked into the living room one day and Jack was stretched out on the carpet with her 6-year-old son stretched out next to him. And her son had his arm around Jack, around the dog. And she heard her son say, "I don't have a heart anymore," her 6-year-old son. And she said, "What are you saying?" Without looking up, her son said, "My heart is in Jack." Now, what is that? What is that Paul felt? What is that happened with the boy and the dog? That permeability, we feel that with people. I make the case in our wild calling that we feel it with animals too, and they feel it with us, I think. Can't speak for them, but we feel it. This story is also short. It's about, I was out on a lake near San Diego several years ago. I was on the water. I have a little boat with a little electric motor. And on the shore, I saw what I thought were 2 turkey vultures. And so I eased up very quietly to them, got within about 20 feet. And they were not turkey vultures. There were 2 really big golden eagles. And as you know, you don't get within 20 feet of golden eagles very often. And I stayed there with this quiet electric motor. I went back and forth so I could stay there in the wind. And we did this for a long time. It seemed like forever, and I'll tell you why I say forever in a second. They would look at me, and then they would go down and take a bite of the fish they were eating, and then look up at me. And then go down, and then look up at me, over and over and over. And we never lost eye contact. The reason I say forever is that I collected hundreds of stories from people about encounters with all kinds of animals, and as well as their pets, wild animals as well as their pets. Some of the common denominators of these experiences are, and I bet you've experienced this, some of you, essentially a kind of a set of altered states. Time disappears or bends. I bet you feel that when you're in the presence of birds sometimes. Or the sense of scale disappears. If you watch an anthill for a while, your sense of scale in the world will change. It's an altered state. I make the case for that. And there are others. So during that time with the eagles, I felt that. Certainly the time stopping or bending. I went home that day and my son, younger son, was home from college. And I told him about what had happened. I said, I felt this something and I don't know what it was. What I can say, Matthew, is whoever I say I am, I'm not. Whoever I was in those moments with the eagles is who I actually am. something very primal that I don't have human language to describe. Again and again, people described experiences like that, that had elements of that in those encounters. Again, I'm not claiming I know what the eagles felt. They may have just been trying to decide if I was edible. But I know something happened there. And so do so many of the people that told me these stories. The book is about a lot of things. There's a lot of science in the book. But the central search of the book is, what is that? What is that thing that happens? There's a great philosopher named Martin Buber. I always have to be careful not to say Justin Bieber. Martin Buber wrote a great essay that some of you may have read called I and Thou. The essay was about the people. And he said that basically you and I don't exist, not really. What exists is right here, is between us. It's the relationship. He used the word relationship a little differently than some of us do. He thought of it literally as a kind of electricity that some people call God. He was writing about people. That's as close as I can get to what so many people describe to me. That thing between us, it's not really me, it's right here. It's the between. I like to name things. So in terms of our relationship with other animals, I call that in the book, the habitat of the heart. I think that there are two habitats. There's the habitat, the physical, natural habitat that we spend so much time and effort, as we should, to preserve, protect, to nurture, to tell our kids about and our grandkids about how valuable that natural landscape is, that habitat. And then there's this other habitat, the habitat of the heart that I've just described, that is very difficult to describe. And we spend very little time thinking about that. We spend very little time nurturing that. We spend very little time talking to our kids and our grandkids about that. But here's the deal. If one of those habitats goes, so does the other one. I think that this has something to do, and I make the case in Wild Calling, that this has something to do with the future of environmentalism, the future of conservation. Environmentalism in recent years has been in trouble. We make the case for the environment based on data often, over and over again, climate change, data, data, data. But something's missing in the argument. And I think it's the habitat of the heart that's missing. Do you remember last summer, the images that came out of Australia when the great fires were happening? Very similar to the fires we have here. My wife and I, by the way, now live in Julian, up in the mountains east of San Diego. And, you know, we were living here knowing about the threat of that fire that could come here like it did in 2003 and several other times. But in Australia, the images that came out of Australia were very moving. You saw people who had just lost their houses rushing into the areas that were in flames, riding bicycles in to take water and food to the wildlife there. There were images of koalas climbing up the legs of people to get to the water bottle. What was that? I don't know about you, but I was moved by that. That speaks well of our species. There is a philosopher in Australia, eco-philosopher named Glenn Albrecht, that I have a lot of respect for. I met him when I was there. And he makes the case, as I do, that data is not enough. Studies, science is important, but the studies, the data is not enough to make the full argument for the preservation of other life on the earth. He points to the great social movements that have turned data into action as models. Civil rights to a degree, feminism, gay rights, the social movements that seem to make progress are the ones that he says are about relationship, about love. I made the case in a recent piece that I wrote that I quoted him, and I said, in addition to that, we need a second element in making the case. And it's what I call imaginative hope. It's not blind hope, it's imaginative hope. For decades, our culture has been addicted not only to oil, but to despair. It's probably at its deepest in the recent few years, this despair. I give a lot of speeches all over the country, at least I used to when I could get on airplanes. And I ask people often, tell me the images, and these are people that come to hear me, they care about the environment, most of them. And I said, what are the images of the far future that come into your head right now? You know, don't think about it too much. Don't intellectualize it. What does it look like? Tell me what the future looks like. Almost always the images people describe are ones that look a lot like Blade Runner and Mad Max and the Hunger Games. At least at best, it has a few animals in it, a few trees. Some of the animals are robot animals. Almost always the images that people carry around with them about the far future are post-apocalyptic images. You know that saying, be careful what you wish for, you might just get it. Be careful what you imagine, you might just get it. What happens to a culture when it can no longer do what Martin Luther King said that we had to do? He said that any movement, any culture will fail if it cannot paint a picture of a world that people will want to go to. What happens to a culture when it can only paint a picture of a post-apocalyptic future? So imaginative hope is to turn that around. I think we need almost a national movement to reimagine the future. I've been collecting great examples of great things that are happening out there. Often there are technological improvements that will help with the four horsemen of apocalypse, which are climate change, biodiversity collapse, pandemic, which is related to all of this, and human isolation. Almost always these are earth-based. For instance, the planting of great forests, not the kind of forests that we cut down for lumber, but more diverse forests. There are all kinds of ideas out there that I've collected from really great innovators about how we can begin to deal with all four of those horsemen at the same time. We don't see those collectively very much. We never see them as a pattern. We don't have enough information really to create new images of the future. That's a great future, not just a sustainable future, but a great future, a nature-rich future. A few years ago, I was at DePaul University and some students took me to lunch. And these were environmental education students. And they had something they wanted to tell me. A young man across the table said that he had tried to join some of the local branches of the national environmental organizations. And he decided they weren't for him. I said, why? He said, every time I went to their meetings, I went away deeply depressed. Then he said that, you know, everybody there looked like you. They were old and they were white. Well, I know I'm white, but thanks a lot about the old part, you know. I have to admit, it's getting there. And he's right. When you look at the demographics of most big environmental organizations, and I haven't looked at National Audubon's demographics lately, he's right. The largest one of the largest environment, it's not Audubon, but one of the largest environmental organizations in the world, the average age is 78, and the average age of new members is 74. I guess the old members get together and they haze the new members. And they're white. So he said they look like you. The girl across the table, I know she was a very hip young woman. I know that because she had tattoos. She leaned across and very seriously said, all my life, I've been told it's too late. And she repeated it. All my life, I've been told it's too late. I thought, she's right. She's about 20 years old. Last 20 years, that's been the mantra. It's been the mantra of the environmental organizations, and I'm an environmentalist. It's also been the mantra of my profession of journalism. It's too late. We have to imagine a better future. We have to begin to imagine cities that can become engines of biodiversity, not just the enemy of biodiversity. We have to imagine a nature-rich future. So I'll stop there, and I've used up a lot of time. Maybe we still have some time for discussion.
Okay, we have a lot of questions here, lots of comments. Let's see. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Richard, is has our new Secretary of Education been in touch with you? Or maybe John Kerry.
No.
It sounds like they should be.
There are some really good people that have been hired by Biden that have been involved in the Children and Nature movement that I have worked with. One of them is Gina McCarthy, who's kind of the chief advisor to Biden on climate change. And she was the head of the Environmental Services Department or something in Connecticut. And she held the first Leave No Child Inside conference and invited me to speak. She's there. Jill Biden has been active in the Children Nature Network, Children Nature movement, and knows some of our people. I've not met her. And there are others that are involved there. So I have great hope, as I did with Obama, and that there were really great champions, including Sally Jewell, the Secretary of Interior. She was a big champion of the Children Nature Network and the movement. So
All right.
I'm hopeful.
Great, thank you. Let's see, Leslie Purcell made a comment about how this ties in really nicely with people recovering from their illnesses more quickly in hospitals when they have a view of nature, which I know from being a hospital administrator is kind of a central tenet of patient-centered care and the connection to nature. And I think she was just bringing that up to have you maybe reflect on that.
What was the central thing she was I was looking at one of the comments.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so Leslie was saying, was commenting on how it's been found in research that people actually recover more quickly from illness when they're hospitalized if they have a view outside to natural things.
Right.
Yeah.
I write a lot about that in the Nature Principle in that book. There's a whole new field, and this is part of this image of a better future, greater future. There's a whole new field of architecture now, biophilic architecture. It's really neat. Biophilia, of course, is E.O. Wilson's the biophilia hypothesis. He didn't come up with the word. It's biophilia hypothesis holds that we are hardwired as a species to have an affiliation with the rest of nature. When we don't get enough of it, we don't do so well. But biophilic architects and designers are designing whole workplaces and other buildings with nature woven into them from the beginning and then kept there. Nature around the building and nature in the building. Sometimes it's live nature, sometimes it's symbolic nature. And the studies show that the people who work in those buildings are far more productive, sick time goes down, turnover gets better, everything gets better. What if whole cities could be designed like that?
We can hope. All right. Ryan Drinick commented that at his elementary campus, the staff use their nature space as a place for kids to calm down when they've had some sort of emotional episode, and they've found that it works really well for teachers too.
It does. And by the way, I can't help. I saw that somebody asked me, it was a story I was telling from My Octopus Teacher, that great documentary that is out. No, my story came out first. That's not the same story, but it has same elements. Very moving documentary. My wife, though, got mad at the guy because he didn't save the octopus. And John Young, who some of you may know, who teaches bird language, and I write about him in Our Wild Calling. I talked to him about that. He said his girlfriend had the same response, and I kind of did too, to be honest. And he knows this guy, and I don't remember his name, in My Teacher, the Octopus. And he says this guy has read some of my work, which of course I like that guy even better now. But he said there's more to that story. He said before they focused on the octopus, they had been studying the sharks that later killed the octopus. Or that actually wasn't the real reason for its death, but they chased it and wounded it and lots of other things. And so they were conflicted. They also liked the sharks. And of course, they were on a non-emotional basis, they were being scientific. So now I've lost track of what you asked me about. Sorry. What was that?
It was about how Ryan was reflecting on how at the school where he teaches, they use the outdoors as a place to help with emotional dysregulation and how it works for teachers as well.
The research that has some of the earliest research that was done in this area was on attention deficit disorder. It's ongoing research at the University of Illinois. It's great stuff. And it shows that just to walk through trees in an urban park, the symptoms of attention deficit disorder go down in kids as young as 5 years old. And again and again, they have found that nature has the same effect on adults. It calms us, it reduces stress. It does other mysterious things too. I can't tell you how many teachers over the years have come up to me later and said that the troublemaker in their class, when they take the class outdoors into a natural setting to learn or to play, the troublemaker becomes the leader, not just better behaved, the leader. I hear that again and again and again. And there's a lot of research now on autism. There's all kinds of research on I mentioned a little bit about play spaces. Every school ought to have these. Every school, and you know what? Finland does. Finland has a school policy where they spend about 45 minutes in the classroom and then they go outside for about 45 minutes. And most of the schools have natural play spaces. And then they come back in for 45 minutes. Finland schools have the highest, it sometimes changes a little bit with another country, but they have the highest, generally the highest math and science test scores in the world. And what are we doing? What have we been doing the last few decades? We've been canceling recess. What are we thinking? And so now that seems to be turning. That tide seems to be turning, but not fast enough. It is in independent schools, but not in public schools.
Well, even in independent schools, it seems that, what I have seen with our family full of special needs kids is there's this ongoing emphasis on ramping up technology and making sure that kids are technology literate, while they leave all of the rest of the stuff behind. And it's a pretty backwards way of thinking that we seem to not be learning from. But anyway, so a lot of people have also mentioned during the pandemic that they have basically saved their sanity by turning outside and looking at birds, which of course people on will do. But even non-birders have been doing that. And of course, we've seen a lot of media attention to that. And there's been a lot of articles out there about it too.
I wrote a piece for an op-ed for the Los Angeles Times back in July about that. And let me share a couple people that I quoted. One was Jody Levine, and she lives in Trabuco Canyon. I don't know if I said that right. She told me that her daughter had been really attached to a screech owl that lived in a tree outside the bedroom window, and then it disappeared. And this happened long before the virus showed up. When the virus showed up, all of a sudden her daughter came running to the parents and said, she was shouting, "The owl's back, the owl's back." And Jody said her young son now gets up really early to watch the owl. And as Jody said, and the owl watches him. And that these connections, Jody said, bring her an awareness of something greater. A friend of mine who lives in Florida told me that she placed a bird feeder outside her elderly mother's bedroom window so she could be soothed by sparrows, chickadees, and doves. And my friend said that she is grateful for, quote, all the fluff and feathers God provides to be healing for our wounded spirit, and that she will never again take the presence of animals for granted.
Wonderful.
You know, there was a study done by MIT years ago, and I read about it in Last Child, and it was about how people talk about nature. And it said even atheists use religious terms, spiritual terms, when they talk about nature. And as you can see, I've used a few here. And I think that's telling that this is in us as humans, to have that sense of connection that maybe a few of us are allowing to surface more these days.
One of the questions posed by Ellen O'Laughlin Villa was, what would you recommend for urban teachers to make the biggest difference for kids in their classes?
Have outdoor classrooms.
Yeah.
And also to look at the research on this. If you go to the Children and Nature Network, which is childrenandnature.org, that's the nonprofit that grew out of Last Child in the Woods. And it's been growing for about 16 years now. One of my goals when we created that was to have one place, you don't have to buy a book, one place that's available to anybody in the world to go and read about the research about how it can transform education, can transform physical health, psychological health, cognitive functioning, all the rest, and what people are doing, the research on different approaches to this. When I wrote Last Child, I could find about 60 studies to cite that I felt comfortable citing in Last Child in the Woods in 2005. I was astonished there were so few studies. I mean, this literally was the elephant in the room. Why was this so understudied? And I worked at the time with a dozen of an organization out of Brandeis that later moved to Harvard that worked on, these were neuroscientists who worked on the brain architecture of young children, how that develops, what stimulates it, what stunts it. And they were looking at all kinds of things along those lines. Bad daycare, lack of parent attachment, all kinds of stuff, violence in the neighborhood. And I asked them one day, have you ever looked at how the experiences in the natural world affect the literal construction of brain architecture in young children? And they looked at me with a blank look, blank faces, and said, what's nature? And I said, I know, I understand. Nature is pretty hard to define. When I wrote Our Wild Calling, I found out that there's at least 124 scientific definitions of life. We can't even decide what life is. So I get it. I know it is hard. But I said to the neuroscientists, this isn't brain surgery. Come up with a hypothesis. You folks do this all the time and test it. 120 trees per acre, I don't know, and test it. It turned out that they were already doing it and didn't know it. I'm afraid to tell you they were using animal subjects in some of their experiments. And they would take the animal, one group of animals over here, and they would stress them out. Then they would take another group over the other side, the control group, and they would put them in what they considered a more natural environment inside the lab. So they already were working with the concept, but the minute you asked them to step outside the lab, they were lost. So that's one of the reasons there's been so little research, is this blind spot, understandable blind spot in science about defining nature. The other issue is, where does the research money come from? What pill can you sell? That's a very real factor in what research does get done. Today, if you go to the Children of Nature Network, you won't see 60 studies. You'll see well over 1,000 studies. And they're coming in still at 10, 15, 20 a month from somewhere in the world. So what was almost non-existent in 2005 has become kind of a growth industry, researching this issue. And it all tends, almost all of it tends to point in the same direction, which is that nature is fundamental to development for children and development to the rest of us for the rest of our lives. It's one of the reasons I make the argument that this should be considered a human right.
Okay, so yeah, why don't you go ahead? Give it a turn too.
Yeah, Richard, when you were telling your octopus story and your golden eagle story and the connection, I was thinking about something that's a lot more frequent with people, and that is a connection with a pet, a dog. In particular, dogs and humans have kind of co-evolved, and so there's a more solid relationship, I would say, or that's there. And as part of the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, adoptions of animals have gone way up.
Yeah.
And so I think there's some beneficial things there. And I'm thinking, well, what piece of nature is missing in that might be advantageous beyond just this animal bond, animal understanding, that would be furthered in an outdoor environment? What's your thinking on that?
Well, one of the reasons that I wrote Our Wild Calling, which is mainly about animals, and more about wild animals than pets, but pets are in there, is that when you look at all those 1,000 studies, almost all of them are of green space and how that affects human development. Now, there's an assumption that there are animals in the green space,
Right.
but it's not directly studied. We know a lot about how domesticated animals affect us. One of the fastest growing therapies in mental health is animal-assisted therapy, using dogs and horses and other animals. Horses, I learned, by the way, and I write about this in the book, recently it was discovered that horses have more facial expressions than dogs. It's just that they're so minute and quick that we don't really see them. Horse whisperers, that may be the definition of a horse whisperer, for whatever reason, they're sensitized to that. And that's one of the reasons why horses are so good in therapy for particularly kids and kids with disabilities and all that. So we know quite a bit about that. That research has really been growing. What has not grown, what we don't know a lot, is how wild animals affect our well-being, specifically wild animals. How does that coyote, when it walks through our backyard and then turns and looks at us, even if it's only a few seconds, what does that do to us? And what does it do to us to live in an environment filled with birds? You know, those studies have yet to be done in the kind of numbers that have been attended to green space. And I'm much more, you know, I write about pets. I write about my own dog when I was a kid, and his effect on me. In that he was a collie, and I spent much of my boyhood in the woods. I needed to spend a lot of my boyhood in the woods. And my dog, my parents often did not know where I was, but my dog always did. My dog Banner. And when I got in trouble, Banner would go home. When I was doing something wrong, Banner knew it and he was head home. And my mother would know that Richie's up to something because the dog came home. And one time I went through ice in the creek in the woods, and I was up to my waist in ice water. And I was trying to get out of the creek. I was about 8, couldn't get up the sides of the ravine that the creek was in because it was snow and it kept turning to ice as I tried to get out. Banner left. Oh, thanks a lot, buddy. He left, but then he came back. And I tell the story, memory is tricky. I know that. But in my memory, it's very clear that Banner then was at the end of a long branch and I was at the other end and I climbed out. Banner did a lot, I won't go into that. Banner did a lot of things like that. Not only with me, but with other people in the neighborhood. I watched him. I watched how he treated younger, smaller dogs in the neighborhood. This was when there were no fences. And there was dogs actually had a social life. And I would watch him. And he, in a sense, was a third parent. And I wrote about this in my Union Tribune column long ago. And I said that I always thought that Banner had taught me a certain set of ethics. And I wrote that and I got accosted by an animal behavioralist who says, no, you're just romanticizing Banner. You're aggrandizing yourself and all that just by telling that story. And, you know, excuse me, I've still got his dog tag on my keychain. And so in the book, I researched where dogs came from. And there's several theories. One is that human beings, our ancestors, domesticated them. We threw bones out beyond the fire and they came closer. And over time, we became interdependent. And they slowly turned into what we call dogs now. And there's another theory, which is wolves domesticated us. These are some German scientists who have written quite a bit about this. And they hypothesize that, yes, we helped to domesticate wolves, but our ancestors, the earliest ones, may have followed wolves as they hunted, as followed the herd that the wolves were hunting, and we watched them. We watched them hunt collaboratively with teamwork. We watched them in their families. Wolves have really tight families, good families. And we may have learned a lot from that. And these scientists actually use the word ethics in their papers about this. So I was real happy when I saw that. And my feeling is the same as it was when I was a kid, but now I know a little bit more, that my ancestors 20, 30,000 years ago watched wolves and watched their ethics. And those ethics may have been picked up, some of them, by my ancestors and passed down through 20, 30,000 years to Banner and then to me. I think that there is a lot more to our relationship to other animals than we even know. There's so much yet to learn. And I will admit that might be romanticizing. I will admit that may not be entirely true, who knows? but there's truth in the thinking about that truth, about that possibility.
Well, we certainly, looking at all the comments and that people have been making in the chat, I can see that you're definitely preaching to the choir here, because everybody's been agreeing and adding on and recommending resources and talking about why don't they consult with you on housing bills so that we build more biophilic housing units, and how we should have your books in all the national park visitor centers. And
They are. Early on, The Last Child in the Woods was picked up and they did a special edition. The national parks did a special edition of Last Child, and they're still out there. So
yeah, and Native Americans and their connection with animals and so on.
yeah.
And last, I just have one last question from Joanne, who was asking if you had thoughts about how we could attract more younger, diverse people to environmentalism. And then we're going to wrap it.
Some of that is being self-recruited right now. Some of the good news is that there are groups like Outside Afro and Latino Outdoors that are really reclaiming roots that go far back. And they are creating all kinds of new groups across the country. They're getting quite a bit of publicity right now. Rue Mapp is the name of the woman who started our Outdoor Afro. And you might want to get in touch with some of those organizations. But one of the first places I spoke after Last Child came out was at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And this is where all of the conservation organizations within the government meet. And the hot topic, and this was in 2006, the hot topic was park rangers and others were retiring because most of them were baby boomers, or they were headed for retirement, and who was going to replace them. And there were two things they were worried about. One was the disconnection of children to nature. What kind of candidates are we going to get? The other thing they were worried about is that the future park rangers were not going to look like America. And how do we do this? And, their solutions that they were presenting were things like, well, we'll put up notices on the bulletin board that we're looking for people of color. And I hope I said it in a nice way, but I said, what are you talking about? Why aren't you in the middle schools recruiting them there now, or even grade schools, by bringing them into, and there is such a thing as junior rangers, but expanding that, really being proactive, going into the schools, and then getting them on a track to a career in the outdoors, some kind of green job, and following them all the way through school. I think the big environmental organizations ought to be doing the same thing.
I agree. All right, so I'm going to unmute Paula. Let's see.
Paula needs to unmute herself. And before she does, I want to thank you very much. It was, as one of our viewers said, a real pleasure and an honor to hear you speak.
Oh, it was for me too.
Yes, thank you so much. So many of your stories, I'm sure, really affected our listeners today. There was a real connection, and I really want to thank you. It was such an honor for you to be with us this evening. And I will continue to read the book that I'm reading, which is the one about the call, whatever, which one is it?
The last calling.
Our wild calling.
Yeah. I love it. I like to read it chapter by chapter. I choose a chapter and I read a chapter, and it really rings true for me in that manner.
Oh, that's great. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
That book was the hardest of all 10 books to write by far.
That's a good one.
And now I'm thinking about another one, and my wife's looking at me funny.
Uh-oh.
So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us this evening. Take care.
You too. Yes, thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye. Thank you so much.